get underway here. We have a small but dedicated audience with us, and hopefully that will grow as people come back from lunch. So first, thank you for joining us. This is the session for the Dynamic Coalition on DNS Issues. And the title of the session today is Beyond Borders, NIS2's Impact on the Global South. My name is Chris Buckridge. I'm here moderating as a sort of IGF gadfly rather than with any particular affiliation. I'm joined by four guests who'll be speaking with us. We have Keith Drazek here to my left, and further to my left we have Bertrand de la Chapelle. Online we have Emily Taylor, and we have Jean-Jacques Sahel. I'm going to let all of them briefly introduce themselves when we start, and they can choose which hats they're wearing or how they would like to identify. We had hoped to be joined by Bruna Santos. Unfortunately, as a MAG member, she has found herself otherwise occupied with a main session, which is taking place right now. So she has had to send her apologies. But I'm sure we will soldier on and we will manage without her. So, this session is sort of following on from what was a really successful session at last year's IGF in Kyoto, where it was discussing the question of governance gaps and particularly in addressing online harms. Yeah, there were a number of outcomes of that. There's quite a good and concise report on the IGF website, but essentially it found that the lines between content and structure or infrastructure can become very blurred very quickly when we start talking about online safety and user safety. And that leads to challenges, leads to problems, and needs to be addressed. So the calls to action that came out of that particular session were for industry and tech community to build capacity, particularly with policymakers, to educate policymakers around the issues, the concerns, the consequences that can come from actions that had not been fully considered, but also for the tech community and industry to develop better coordination mechanisms to handle online harms. So that's leading us back here today to this session, which is going to build on, I think, very similar themes, sort of look at what's developed in the last 12 months, but also using NIS2, which is the second version of the directive on the security of networks and information systems. And it's a directive in the European Union, which has had some impact and some intersection with DNS operations, with operators in the EU and beyond. There has been discussions of that at ICANN meetings over the last 12 months. I know there was a very good discussion in Hamburg, which is nearly 12 months ago now, but it's an ongoing discussion in that community. I think we'll probably touch on some of those issues here, but hopefully also being an IGF space rather than an ICANN meeting, it will also making a little bit more generalized into how these kinds of issues can be addressed in a multi-stakeholder fashion and what really needs to be considered and what we need to aspire to. So we have sort of two segments of this discussion. And in the first one, I'm going to speak to Emily and Jean-Jacques. It's essentially about supporting policymakers in developing adequate measures for addressing online harms, reflecting on that NIS2 directive, but also general governance gaps and jurisdictional challenges, which I know both Emily and Bertrand have worked very, very extensively on. And what sort of collaborative steps there are to support policymakers. So I'm going to go, I think, Emily, to you first, if that's okay. And perhaps you can also provide some background and context beyond what I've been able to on the NIS2 situation as it applies to this community and more broadly. But so, yeah, what are the significant governance gaps that NIS2 directive does seek to address, and what have been the impacts of that, particularly on the DNS industry?
Much, Chris, and thank you for moderating today, and best wishes to everybody attending the IGF in Riyadh in person. My name's Emily Taylor.
Sorry, Emily, can I just pause you for 1 second?
Yeah.
We seem to have had much worse sound now than we had.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah. Are we able to, but up the back, have the sound, just check how this is working? Because good sound in the room, but the sound from online is terrible.
I can hear you very well.
Yeah, maybe keep speaking and we'll see if they're able to
Okay. So
make some
what I'll
remedy.
do is I'll introduce myself because it doesn't really matter if you can't hear that bit.
Okay.
My name's Emily Taylor. I'm a co-founder of the DNS Research Federation, a non-profit that's dedicated to understanding the impact of the architectural layers of the internet on policy. I'm also a founder of the Global Signal Exchange, a partnership with the Global Anti-Scam Alliance, and we work very closely on the DNS issues dynamic coalition, which we've done for several years. So I'd like to just preface my remarks about NIS2, because it's never a good look for a Brit to be criticising European legislation. And I would just like to say for context that I voted to remain every time I got the opportunity and would do so again. The context for
Emily,
NIS2, yeah,
it's almost incomprehensible
impossible.
here. I know that the sound from the Zoom
Oh,
to other Zoom participants is fine. So Zoom itself is working. It's I guess
the
the
sound in the
connection
room.
from Zoom software to the AV system here is working very poorly.
Oh, I'm
Um,
sorry to hear it, Chris. We
well,
can hear you beautifully.
I'm just gonna see if we can jiggle the connection or something.
Yeah, and maybe start with somebody in the room. I don't know if, I mean, we can
Let's
just
give it
anything
one.
that you can do. I'm ready to respond.
Okay, maybe just give us 30 seconds and we're going to see if there's anything we can do here. People who are in Zoom, it sounds okay. Yeah, just jiggle that or yeah, that. Emily, could you speak again?
Unmute me. Is this any better? I will just sort of just keep saying random words and.
Yeah, it's fine in Zoom.
Is it fine in the room?
Everything is coming good for this far. See, what is my job is I'm sending output.
Even worse. Okay.
You are blaming me. Problem with this means. See, I'm getting see that her voice getting crackle means I cannot do anything. Please.
I assume it's the same for, like, I can hear you perfectly, Emily. I don't know if you can hear me well.
I can hear you perfectly, Jean-Jacques.
Okay, maybe we'll start with Bertrand, and hopefully they'll keep trying to fix this, and we'll come back to you, Emily. So, thank you both for your flexibility. So Bertrand, please.
Does that work? Yeah, okay, it's much better. So I was expecting, and apologies, I have a sore throat, so my voice is not exactly the way it is supposed to be. There are a few things that are important, and I will let Emily, when she's back, develop more specifically the elements regarding these two. What I think we need to understand at a higher level is that there's a sense of powerlessness by all the different actors regarding something that is extremely difficult to address, which is online abuse, because it is spread. We have an international network or transnational network that doesn't recognize borders, which is the very big value of the internet. And at the same time, a legal apparatus that is based on 190 different jurisdictions and legal systems. And at the international level, I want to highlight also, in the context of the whole discussion about WSIS plus 20, etc., that the international space, the UN and the rest, have not produced in the last 20 years since the World Summit on the Information Society any comprehensive framework to address transnational issues. We need to recognize this. And I take the opportunity to highlight that in contrast, the technical operators who have managed the internet since the beginning and who are working under a multi-stakeholder approach have allowed the internet to function, including during the harshest period of the pandemic, where basically the whole world was hanging on a thread, which was the internet. So it was an aside, but the problem of online abuses is a paradigm for how can we address things that are transnational with an apparatus that is a series of national laws. And that creates two fundamental questions. One is the compatibility of the laws that are adopted in one country or in region versus the laws of another country. And the second thing is the question of extraterritoriality. The question of the compatibility of the laws is something that is a requirement in terms of coordination between the different actors. For the European Union, the feeling that there is a critical mass market, and for better or worse, that there is a sort of Brussels effect, leads to a desire to adopt legislation that is, one, solving a certain number of problems for the bloc itself, but also applied to actors that are outside of the bloc, because those actors are performing services on the territory of the European Union. So, ironically, and I want to emphasize how ironic it is, in order to defend your sovereignty as a state or as a group of states, you need to do extraterritorial regulation, which is the exact opposite of territorial sovereignty. And it's a conundrum. And I don't want to belabor too much, but there is one concept that I would like to share, which is we should be talking about responsible extraterritoriality. Because it is unfair to tell a government, thou shalt not have any extraterritorial legislation, but it is unfair for a government or a group of governments to say we have the capacity to do anything we want because you're located elsewhere and you impact our territories. So I'm very fond of what I'm increasingly calling the Goldilocks rule. You know, the famous story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, where there is a soup that is too hot, one too cold, and one that is just right. And I think in regulation, we need to have this constant reminder of responsibility under the Goldilocks rule, which is there are things that you need to do. And I mean, you need to be beyond a non-action, but there are things that you shouldn't be doing because it is excessive. And this applies for the governments, and this applies, and we'll talk to you about it afterwards, to the operators. That's the way to understand responsibility. And the final remark is, because it is a transnational problem, it is something that cannot be solved by either the governments alone or the companies alone, but it is a cooperation, a coordination, because otherwise the abusers are going to move from one place to the other, and it's a constant whack-a-mole exercise. So I just wanted to introduce this notion of responsible extraterritoriality to say that responsibility is not only on the side of the the private actors, but also on the side of the public actors when they elaborate their legislation. And I let Emily, if she's back on, develop more the specific aspects of NIS2.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. And we will give Emily a chance to, to try out the technology again. I just want, it's fascinating for me, having been in the space for a while, as I think most of us in the room have, to hear the term extraterritoriality move from what was essentially a curse word to something that is being integrated and accepted as necessary, but with caveats. And so that's a very important journey to understand, I think. Emily, can we try you again and see if the audio is better?
That you can hear me. I can hear the room perfectly. And I think that Jean-Jacques can hear me and the other Zoom participants can.
Yeah,
maybe if you can follow the
Emily, I'm just going to say, so maybe, yes, keep talking. It seems like the transcription can hear you. We
Okay.
still can't hear you well, but I think they're able, while you're talking, they're better able to try and remedy the situation. So please keep talking, and we'll hope that it gets better as we go forward.
First of all, I'd like to say I'm very angry with Bertrand for using the Goldilocks analogy, because I had thought of the Goldilocks analogy and I was very proud of myself. So wait for it when it comes in later. But, you know, just as context, Bertrand has set the scene as usually beautifully. And one of the things I'd like to just state as before diving into NIS2 is the complexity and sheer scale of EU digital regulation. I think this is, and also how complex it is for anyone to comply with the regulation. At a recent legal conference, it was reported that there was a guy walking around with a T-shirt that said, "Only God is GDPR compliant." And I think that this really highlights the complexity of trying to comply with EU legislation. There are currently 115 pieces of digital legislation from the European Union, representing thousands of pages. And for small and even large businesses, this is complex, and there are also internal inconsistencies. So amid this orgy of lawmaking, why should the DNS escape? Because the approach is contagious. And here we have the second version of a directive, which has to be transposed into each member state law, whose purpose is to strengthen basic cybersecurity hygiene. And, you know, thinking about Bertrand's remarks about the necessity for business, for all stakeholders to work very closely with regulators, I think it's worthwhile reflecting that there is a very small part of the NIS2 directive that relates to the domain name sector. The shorthand reference is Article 28. But one thing I wanted to highlight is that after the European Commission and other EU governments
If you can just stop
participated...
for 1 second. We've lost your audio completely, which I'm hoping is the first step on to rectifying the whole
better
situation.
things. Yeah.
Are we able to connect back? Okay, Emily, can you continue speaking, please?
Sure. So the regulation relating to who is nothing at all?
Sorry, Emily. Hoping to make a bad situation better. We've made it worse, I think.
Okay.
Okay, Emily, can you one more go, please?
Yes. Shall I just carry on speaking and hope that people can read the transcription?
Okay. Yeah, Emily, if you can, that's do just carry on. We'll read the transcription and hopefully we'll get it sorted shortly.
Yeah, so I'm just going to make a few observations about Article 28 of the NIS2 directive, which for those who are not familiar with it, relates to the registration data of domain names and imposes obligations on the domain name supply chain to take certain actions without getting into the detail of what it says. But just one reflection before I dive in is that the NIS2 draft came into being after the Commission and several other member states' governments participated in an expedited policy-making process through ICANN that was designed to sort out who is. So the fact that legislation emanated as a result of that or after that tells us that something didn't go quite right. So three observations about where we are. This is a directive, and so under EU European system, that means that every member state has to make a law at national level to reflect it. And the overwhelming trend that we have been seeing in our NIS2 Article 28 tracker, which you can look at on the DNS Research Federation website, number one observation is lateness. The Commission has in fact started infraction proceedings against 23 of the 27 member states for failing to transpose the directive before the deadline of the 17th of October. The second is, and here I'm channeling Bertrand, the Goldilocks effect, inconsistency among the member states. So there is a number of member states that are taking perhaps too soft an approach, like Mummy Bear, with less than was in the directive. Some perhaps taking too hard an approach, like Daddy Bear. Here an example is the Czech Republic, which is imposing fines of up to $2 million per offence for failure to comply with Article 28. And then there is the just right baby bear approach, where several member states have taken exactly the draft of the directive. So maybe with the guidance of the NIS2 cooperation group, a group of governments supplemented with ENISA and European Commission officials, that will help to smooth the wrinkles. But what we're looking at the moment is a diversity, a lack of harmonisation, even within the European Union itself. And to take the theme of extraterritoriality a little further, this is the first experience I've had of a directive that has extraterritorial effect. So as well as very clearly in Article 26, framing the scope of the Article 28, sorry for so many article numbers, to capture whoever is providing services into the European Union. We also have the prospect of perhaps forum shopping within the Union itself. So if you can provide a nexus to a country where the transposition suits your purposes, then why not try to take action in that member state against somebody else who has perhaps a stronger nexus with a different one. So I think we're going to have, as we lawyers say, a field day ahead as we start to navigate the complexities of this. But I'm very sorry that we lost Bruna as a speaker due to logistical issues this morning, because one thing that we really wanted to highlight in this workshop was the impact of extraterritoriality on Global South and the democratic deficit, if you like, of states and people who are affected by legislation that they have no say in framing and they have no recourse in challenging. They are just obligated to follow it. Now, clearly, there is an awful lot to recommend the EU approach in that it is a thoughtful process, that there is a lot of internal consultation and consultation with stakeholders. And in a lot of ways, the European Union is becoming the world's regulator in technology with those 115 pieces of regulation. But what we're also seeing, as Bertrand mentioned, is that other states do take that extraterritoriality for their own regulation, states that don't have the same protection for fundamental rights and freedoms, and therefore there is a prospect of many cross-cutting obligations and very confusing landscape for those who want to challenge it. So I will just, as a final remark, and I will just wrap up by saying it's still not clear who the NIS2 Article 28 applies to. And at the DNS Research Federation, we will be publishing the results of our ecosystem discovery, which will show that the extraterritorial effect does apply in the NIS2 Article 28, that many service providers from outside the Union will be caught by its provisions, and also highlight a blog series that we've started to roll out using case studies from other industries on know your customer. So one of the aspects of Article 28 is that you're supposed to verify and make sure that WHOIS data is accurate. So we, and Georgia's in the room, she might be able to say a few words on this later in the Q&A, Chris. We've been looking at case studies from the dating app industry, from finance and from crypto to see what lessons might be learned by the domain industry as they are facing the implementation of this new regulation. So I will leave it there and look forward to joining the discussions later.
Thank you very much, Emily. And it's great to hear you hear you clearly. No? Okay.
I can hear you.
All right, here we go. Yeah, great to hear you clearly, even if I now can't hear myself clearly. Oh, it's my headphones. Technology, huh? and I appreciate your commitment to the Goldilocks metaphor as well. There, you really took us very deeply into that. It would be good to break up. I know we still have Keith and Jean-Jacques to hear from, but I think that's sort of a second segment, and it'd be good to sort of hear from anyone who is in the room and has been triggered or inspired or has thoughts based on what we've discussed so far. I mean, I know, also looking to Bertrand and Emily and also Jean-Jacques and Keith, we talked about one of the questions we had, and it flows on a little from what you were saying there at the end, Emily, is what lessons there might be for policymaking in non-European regions. I think you were talking about lessons for operators, for industry, and obviously you highlighted that as a directive, this is quite a, in some ways, uniquely European mechanism in that it then creates further fragmentation by the different implementations. But so, yeah, are there lessons there for policymaking, policymakers in non-European regions about what's happened here? Maybe if either of you would like to answer that, and sort of looking to the floor here also if others have comments they'd like to make.
I can have a go, or Jean-Jacques might, or one of the others might. I hesitate to really to instruct or policymakers on this. I think my reflection would be for the industry and other stakeholders. There is a global coordination for regulating domain names, or at least, coordinating domain name policy. And I think the fact that we've seen regulation in the European Union on domain name policy should make us pause and reflect on what fell down in that, because there's abundant expertise. There is an awful lot of discussion of the issues, and I'm not going to pretend that the issues relating to WHOIS are simple. They're not simple. They are about understanding and accepting that there are multiple legitimate points of view here. There are legitimate points of view and legitimate expectations of privacy for individuals, not to have their name, address, phone number, email address published to the whole world at large. There are also legitimate expectations that law enforcement, and yes, even the enforcement of civil law rights, such as intellectual property rights, those also are legitimate. And somehow we have to navigate this. But actually, the best people who know the issues have failed to reach consensus over a 25-year period, despite abundant discussions within ICANN. And I think we should reflect on what went wrong and how the ICANN process and multi-stakeholder processes can evolve to break deadlock and reach balanced and moderate solutions that serve the public interest.
Thank you very much, Emily. We have a question here in the room. And then, well,
all right, thanks. Hi, I'm Owen Fletcher, for the record. The Goldilocks analogy and the idea of, as I think you put it, Bertrand, responsible extraterritoriality, those are both interesting ideas. It strikes me that one could interpret the middle ground that you're trying to reach there in a lot of possible different ways. So what are the sorts of lines that you have in mind that you would hope not to see crossed these regulations?
I think First of all, the what I now call the Goldilocks rule is a mindset. It's having constantly the question in mind, what is not enough and what is too much. It can vary from case to case. On the case of extraterritoriality, to go back to what was discussed about the impact on third countries, it is not new with the NIS2 or other. It's true with the GDPR. And I've had discussions with people in Africa or in Latin America who feel that if on the one hand they consider that the protection of privacy is absolutely legitimate and important, it was basically pushed down their throats without them having any say in this. So if we accept, as Chris was mentioning, that instead of being an absolutely unacceptable exception, extraterritoriality is part of the package of regulating transborder things, there's a new type of consultation that needs to take place, which is involving the stakeholders, i.e. the actors who have a stake, and those who have a stake are also the ones that are impacted by. Which means that in the international arena, I don't know how to do it, but we're lacking a space where, for instance, the European Union or the United States, for that matter, would basically have a way to explain early on what the mechanisms of a new regulation are before it is actually implemented. And I want just to mention that the horror of the United States authorities about how can you imagine having something extraterritorial immediately prompts the reaction like, it hurts when you're on the receiving side, right? Because we've been receiving extraterritoriality from the United States for ages, and now it's a competition which is dangerous. It is a legal arms race, as we've qualified this in INJ for more than 5 years. And this legal arms race is really dangerous because we're talking about the fragmentation of the internet, but it's not the internet that is fragmented. It is the legal regime that applies to the internet that is already fragmented and that risks becoming incoherent, which is even more. So there's no simple answer to your question apart from having this sort of compass in mind where who are the stakeholders? Who am I impacting when I'm taking a decision beyond my territorial authority? And how far am I going in terms of unintended consequence? I loved Emily's remark about God is GDPR compliant. I mean, I constantly rage against the GDPR, which makes me spend more time clicking on refusal than on reading the article that I'm trying to access. I mean, this is an unintended consequence that was not taken into account. So the too much or too little is just a guiding principle.
Thanks, Bertrand. I'm going to give briefly to Keith, and then David. I know we have some comments online, and then Georgia, I also see your hand.
Thank you very much, Chris. Hi, everybody. I'm Keith Drazik. I'm with VeriSign, the registry operator for .com and .net. So I want to agree with Emily's comments earlier and provide a little bit of context about the challenges facing the ICANN multi-stakeholder process and the bottom-up consensus building policy development work. Emily is absolutely right. There was an expedited policy development process that was initiated around the time of GDPR going into effect. And there was intense work. That work was divided in the ICANN space into two components. There was the phase one work to ensure compliance. ICANN's contracts were able to be in compliance with GDPR. I think that was highly successful. There was a second phase that was focused more on the questions of access and disclosure to registrant data that had previously been publicly available, generally speaking, acknowledging that there were privacy and proxy services and other aspects. But generally speaking, a system that was publicly available that had people's personal data available for search online. And the questions of access and disclosure became quite sticky and very challenging and resulted in not a lot of satisfaction for anybody. There was very little consensus, if any, on that question. There's ongoing work within the ICANN space to figure out next steps about standardized access and disclosure systems. But Emily is right that the multi-stakeholder process within ICANN did not produce results that were satisfactory to everyone. And I think what we've seen in NIS2, particularly Article 28, is a reaction to the fact that the ICANN community didn't deliver something that was satisfactory, in this case, to the European Commission, the European Union regulators there. And therefore, we've now seen regulation coming out that essentially has overtaken or leapfrogged the work in the ICANN space that is still dragging on, frankly. And as somebody who participates actively in the ICANN community on a daily basis, I acknowledge that the ICANN community and the multi-stakeholder system must become more efficient, more effective, more able to deliver results in a timely fashion, or we risk what we've seen recently, and especially with NIS2 Article 28, is regulation coming from a particular jurisdiction that has extraterritorial impact and could result in a fragmented approach where we end up with a number of different regulations from a number of different jurisdictions. And as an operator of registry services and in the technical community and the business community, that type of fragmentation is very unhelpful. It's very it's a real challenge for any operator to have multiple requirements coming from multiple jurisdictions and having to operate in that type of an environment. So I'm just as a general statement, as a multi-stakeholder participant, we have to be more nimble in our ability to deliver so that we can avoid this type of extraterritorial regulation, or at a minimum, make sure that there's better collaboration, better coordination, so there's more consistency in whatever variation or variability there may be. So thanks, Chris.
Thanks very much, Keith. David, please, we've got some remote comments. And then we'll have Georgia and Jean-Jacques.
Chris. We have a remote question for Emily from Sebastian Ducos, but I'd like to read it out so everyone here in the room can hear the question. So over to you, Emily. Are the Article 28 requirements on every registrant's data a scope creep on a legislation which was drafted to secure critical infrastructure?
I'm happy to jump in. Chris, are you, shall I respond to the question now, or do you want to go to Jean-Jacques and Georgia first?
Relatively brief response, then we can go to Georgia and then Jean-Jacques.
Yeah, I can keep it very brief. Excellent question, Sebastian. Thank you very much. It is quite an anomaly in the NIS2 directive to see. It's a little bit like a little spaceship has landed in the middle of this directive, which is all about network security, all the stuff that you would expect in a very cybersecurity approach. And it also, I think, flags some bumps in the road ahead, because in the main, the implementation of the directive at national level has been handed to the National Cybersecurity Centre, who are very comfortable with issues such as, how do you safeguard against, insider threats or raise your game of basic cyber hygiene, but perhaps less comfortable with the domain name system and the intricacies of it. So I think that this provides both an opportunity and a threat for those interested in the domain name system, because it is likely to remain a backwater, but also perhaps not to have that much expertise in terms of those who are in charge of the regulation going forward. So thank you for the question.
Thanks, Emily.
Georgia, please.
Great. Georgia may not be able to unmute herself. Can we make Georgia a co-host so she can unmute? Or just unmute her? Yeah, okay. We'll go to Jean-Jacques first. Jean-Jacques, thank you for your patience. I know you're one of our speakers, and it's good to, this is your first turn at the mic, so good to see you.
Okay, let's try. I hope you can hear me okay. I wanted to just comment briefly on this first part. and extraterritoriality. And I think it's whether or not extraterritoriality remains a good or a bad word. I think the problem is that it's very often, in my mind, something that will lead to ineffectiveness. So what I'd like to offer in terms of thinking about the risks, it's actually two things. And I want to also mention that it's not just nowadays about some countries from the global north. We're seeing countries from anywhere in the world starting to do extraterritorial legislation, and some of them in such a way that they might well have an impact well beyond their borders, whether it's because of the sheer size of the fines that they're talking about, or because, I mean, we have countries currently that are proposing fines that amount to 30% of turnover for online harms, for just potentially just one piece of online harm. I mean, it's frankly ridiculous. So, either they think that they're going to have they're important enough that they will have an impact internationally and companies will just pay up, or they are ready to take the risk that their people will suffer from having a vastly reduced amount of information and resources available from the global internet, because a huge number of platforms will refuse to just bother with that country. And I think that's really the wrong way to think about it. So I think the policymakers across the world really need to think about the practical impact of what they're proposing. And that leads me to the sort of two key things that two key concepts I think are hugely important here. The first one is impact assessment, and the other is consultation or multi-stakeholder participation. So impact assessment in the EU, it's at least, and in some other places, having an impact assessment as you propose legislation is mandatory under law. And I really think it's needed. An impact assessment could be, can be broader or smaller, but at least it should consider things like economic impact, but also technical impact potentially, and then impact beyond. And that's frankly not done well in many places. I mean, not that it's easy, but I think when you're putting together a new piece of legislation, you need to think about the impact it's going to have on users. You need to think about the impact it's going to have on businesses, and you need to think about the impact it's going to have on whatever is the practical application, which in our case might be the internet infrastructure. And I really do think that a lot of legislation we've seen around the world, this is not just about the EU, around the world relating to the internet, just hasn't done its homework in terms of impact assessment. And then from the impact assessment, if you have done a proper impact assessment, then it leads to the consultation process. And very often we see consultations just being posted on a website. But actually, if you want to do things well as a policymaker, you don't just publish the consultation on the website for free people to see. You proactively go out there to solicit input from the relevant stakeholders. And so whether it's for the NIS directive or GDPR or indeed legislations elsewhere in the world, I don't think we should just point the finger at the EU. I think that's actually a bit unfair in a way, because there are many other jurisdictions where it's not done properly. We should have a much more inclusive process of consultation and multi-stakeholder involvement, because that's where you have the proper input, where you might have the technical community weighing in and thinking, hold on, if you do this, X, Y, Z might happen. Or you might have, in fact, the other side of the house, if you will, that says, be careful what you wish for. For instance, you're working on a privacy legislation. You want to make sure that the other side of the government that's dealing with safety and security is able to make sure that it aligns with their own objectives, so that you end up with a balanced outcome. If you're thinking about consumer groups, they're able to tell you what might be the impact on consumers. So, for instance, you're passing a new legislation on online harms. You want to make sure that the way that the processes to support consumers are actually not too complex and burdensome in such a way that actually it means that consumers will just not report, not seek redress, because it's just so complex. So I think, again, I think we really need to think about it from a process perspective. We need much better impact assessments across the board, and related to that, much better multi-stakeholder involvement, not just an anonymous consultation that very few people will see and respond to. Thanks. I hope you heard some of this.
We did. No compliments to the audio staff here. We've got it all fixed now, so it's working well. Touch wood, it's working very well. Georgia, please.
Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me. So yeah, thank you so much for everyone's comments on it. And I just wanted to touch on what Jean-Jacques said about the impact assessment. I come from a law enforcement sort of practical background, and my first thought around this was, you know, how can we make practical solutions around this? You know, I'm not a lawyer, so the Article 28 of the NIS2 directive to me was like, how can we as an industry create solutions that can help this and can help us move forward? And as Emily mentioned, I've been doing a project around KYC. And looking at how other or know your customer, which is a way that businesses or organizations can get to know a consumer to ensure that fraud or criminal activity is not taking place. And it happens differently in very different industries. But I think it's important to note that in some industries, it's not regulated to be so. So such as the dating app sector, which have voluntarily put in various KYC processes to help understand who their customer is, but also to protect them. And I think my point here is around the impact assessment, which is not always being done, but in terms of other industries, they have an understanding of what the harms are, what the kind of real harms are in terms of dating apps, in terms of banking and finance, which is a lot where fraud kind of ends up. And ultimately, the principle of the NIS2 directive was to help, you know, bring cybersecurity up to a high standard for everybody. So I think when going into this, it's really important to know what the principle is behind it, but also how we can get to practical solutions. And I thought this could be, in terms of industry collaboration, how the dating app sector have done it is that they've solicited third-party providers to help them with it, as well as automation and technical solutions. But it seems to have worked very well, and they haven't, customers don't decide not to use a service because of that. If anything, they probably decide to use a specific service because it's safer for them as a consumer. So I just wanted to kind of point that out in terms of a general understanding of, from my point of view, of a practical understanding of NIS2, that industry kind of works together to create solutions, and it doesn't necessarily have to be regulation led.
Thanks very much, Georgia. I think the points you're making actually segue us very nicely into what was envisaged as segment 2 of this discussion. It's been a bit of an organic discussion in the meantime, which has been great. But the segment B that we had sort of sketched out here was about promoting industry collaboration. So developing that ecosystem to engage with policymakers to ensure that there can be that kind of multi-stakeholder process. And so particularly looking at building that cross-silo collaboration within the DNS ecosystem, but looking beyond that as well and addressing governance gaps with a focus on the Global South. And we've talked a little bit about that already, and examples of effective collaboration and data sharing practices. And again, Georgia, I think you just gave us some very interesting and specific ones. But I do want to sort of throw here to, I guess Keith probably is the, we've got Keith and Jean-Jacques to speak, and Keith, maybe I'll ask you first, particularly in the sort of DNS industry, but like what are the current barriers that we see to cross-sectoral, cross-silo collaboration and work?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chris. Yeah, no, that's a perfect segue. And I know we've talked specifically about NIS2 here in the first segment, but I want to sort of use that as an example and jump off from that to say NIS2 Article 28 in particular, I think, is an example where it was a reaction to something else that happened as a result of regulation. And we want to try to, as industry, and I say industry, I'm talking about in this case the internet infrastructure industry, where we have registries and registrars at the DNS level, and then we've got focused primarily on technical harms, and again talking about online harms here, and then hosting providers, CDNs, ISPs, and others in the infrastructure stack, who we all have our different roles, responsibilities, and technical capabilities to mitigate harms within within our operations or in our experience. And we as industry need to do a better job of collaborating and cooperating to identify those harms and to make sure that there's a clear understanding among us as to our respective roles and responsibilities. And so there's enhanced or improved cooperation and information sharing about what we're seeing, about trends, about abuse reporting, and to make sure that the most appropriate actor is taking that action proactively. But all of this is in the context of, I think, enhanced industry engagement, so we can engage externally with regulators so that as they seek to regulate, as we expect they will, they do so in an informed way. And so looking ahead, I think what we are hoping to achieve through enhanced industry engagement is to be able to work with regulators, to work with legislators, to make sure that any regulation that does come is more aligned with a full understanding of who we are, what we do, and how we do it, what the limitations are in terms of our technical capabilities, and importantly, as Chris, you asked one of the, what are sort of the obstacles or the challenges, is that at least for those of us that operate in the ICANN multi-stakeholder community, ICANN's bylaws prohibit it from being a content moderator, right? From getting engaged in content matters. And so we in the registry and registrar space in the GTLD world have contracts, and we have contracts that require us to take action. And that same regime does not exist as you start talking about hosting providers and other actors sort of up the stack. They certainly are required to be compliant with local law and jurisdictional requirements, but it's not the same sort of contractual regime that we have in the DNS space. So I think it's important for those of us who are registries and registrars to also engage with the content operators, kind of hosting providers, et cetera, to make sure that we're aligned and having better engagement, both operationally together, but as we engage with regulators. So maybe, Chris, I'll stop there, and happy to continue this dialogue.
Yeah, no, thanks, Keith. And I mean, well, to me, certainly it jumps out the complexity of that venue ecosystem of where is the appropriate place to govern or to regulate or to make these kinds of arrangements is, clearly a barrier, or at least a hurdle to be overcome. So that, really an interesting note there. But Jean-Jacques, can I come to you? I mean, coming from a bit of a different perspective there, and I guess also asking you sort of where do you see the barriers to that cross-industry collaboration, and also and perspectives from global South to shape more inclusive governance and collaboration models. Are there lessons or things that we can look at to sort of improve that?
Okay, thanks, Chris. Can you hear me, by the way? Is that okay?
You can.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Look, I'll come back on the detail on cross-industry collaboration. I think we need to place it in a broader perspective of the fact that around the world, both in the North and the South, we do need to reinforce, to make sort of both the industry, government, and broader multi-stakeholder dialogue an ongoing part of policy and legislative development. I don't think it's happening remotely as much as it should be. We still see in panels, even in places like Brussels, where you may have just one part of industry next to the policymakers, not all sectors that should be represented. Very often, civil society and consumer groups are not there. So you're missing the point in terms of comprehensive and effective policy development and legislative development. So I think that's quite important. I think we really need to mainstream this idea of a regular dialogue. And I think it's really important when we talk about online harms, because if we focus on the role of industry, online harms are evolving very fast. And governments cannot realistically catch up all the time. They have to have this dialogue with industry and the technical community at least, and consumer groups to understand better the consumer perspective. That is absolutely necessary in order to understand the practical realities of online harms and how best to deal with them. And that's really not happening sufficiently. Again, that's not just a North or South issue. I think that's across the board. So we really need, again, to sort of mainstream, what we here at the IGF and in the WSIS process for the past 20 years have known, which is that multi-stakeholder governance is the right thing for the internet. It should be obvious to everyone today that it is needed at national level as well when we're developing laws, but that's still not happening, whether it's for the internet and for other relevant sectors. So that's the first thing. We really need to improve that. But in terms of the practical realities, I think there are some issues in terms of basic understanding of some of the ways in which we deal with online harms in the digital world. There's a very low understanding of the processes that exist to flag, at the very basic level, to flag bad content to digital platforms, whether as a user or as a government. And that touches on the extraterritorial aspect. The government can submit a removal request under its national laws, and that will be just for that country. But then if they submit a flag, like users can, against a company's policies, then that could be handled at a global level if it fits an inappropriate behavior that's understood at global level. So there's an interesting area here where, again, an industry-government dialogue would really help in finding the most practical and effective ways in which to pursue online harms, to deal with them. And so I think a bit of that is around capacity building and having that dialogue. I want to flag here, for instance, that some of the UN agencies like the UN Office of Drugs and Crime have been very helpful in organizing sessions for law enforcement and local government agencies for them to get in touch with digital platforms and understand those reporting processes. And more of that would be really, really helpful. And then they would help with some of the focus of today's discussion, which is some of the day-to-day constraints we have in going after online harms. For some of the most egregious harms, things like criminal activities like scams, for instance, scams and fraud, there's a need for sharing intelligence, right? And so sharing data. And some of that data can be sensitive. We're talking about accounts. They can be personal names sometimes if we're talking about the criminals. Now, for that to be safe from a legal perspective, we need to have the right legal frameworks, right? And as we've discussed before, they don't always exist fully in terms of international frameworks. At the local level, they might exist, but we don't always have an alignment between safety laws and data protection laws. So in some cases you have, or in many cases, unfortunately, what we encounter is companies across sectors, right? This is not just the digital sector. If you're talking about something like scams, you need cooperation with the banks or the telecom companies. Now, if you want to be effective, you need to be able to identify that something is a piece of scam. And very often as a digital platform, we only have a part of the puzzle. So we might not always be able to ascertain that something is a criminal piece, is a criminal harm from just what we have access to. We might need to corroborate that versus data from a bank, for instance, about transactions, or from a telecom operator. In order to share that intelligence, very often what we find is people say, hold on, I can't share that data because data protection laws are stopping me from doing that. And that might not actually be the case, but it might not be very clear in the law. So we might need more guidance. We might need some more clarifications, and that's often what happens. And I think that's something that we, you've mentioned the discussions on the WHOIS and the GDPR, and I think we're finding similar types of headaches, if not constraints, in relation to scams, where a number of companies are saying, whoa, I can't exchange data. Even though it's about scams, it's about finding bad people. And yes, there's supposed to be caveats and carve-outs in GDPR, for instance, in order to tackle things like criminal activities. I'm not comfortable from a legal standpoint that I will not be in breach of GDPR if I exchange that sort of data. And so that's even with the EU, which is a pretty advanced framework, but we find that in many other jurisdictions. So there's a need here really to think about making sure that we have alignment between different laws. And that goes back to my earlier comment that when you are crafting the law, you might want to make sure that you have the right stakeholders around the room, that you have a fit between different laws. And often what happens is laws are developed in silos. And so you end up with conflicts of laws effectively between a security and safety law that tells you absolutely need to deal with, say, financial crime and scams, and another one that says, but you can't exchange data. So as a company, you're stuck. And you want to do the right thing, but you're actually prevented from doing so in many ways. And an additional thing in relation to that is the importance of due process generally, and when we are dealing with online harms. And here what we find is that there's often a lack of understanding of some of the processes by at least the digital platform, probably some of the other intermediaries, which is we need to abide by due process. And that means that we have to review every flag that we are presented with, following due process, and that includes making sure that it fits with human rights safeguards. And although it might not be very detailed, actually human rights is one of the areas where we do have international frameworks. However, I can tell you from experience that in many jurisdictions, again, both North and South, we find governments saying, why are you doing this human rights review? You're just not respecting the law. You're trying our national law. You're trying to impose another country's construct onto us by pretending that you need to do a human rights review. Well, actually, that's far from the truth. If you look at least at the processes that we have at Google, we've specifically referred to human rights guidelines by the United Nations. So they're well accepted. But we do find this pushback. And I think that's where there really needs to be an understanding. Where we do have international frameworks, they should be followed and understood. Where we have constraints or gaps, and since this is the focus, I think that there are gaps in terms of some of the data that we're able to share. I think this is where we need to look to some of the conventions. In particular, I want to mention the convention on cybercrime, the Budapest Convention, which has a second additional protocol which provides human rights and privacy safeguards. That's the sort of good practices that are respected at the international level, which we would hope more countries would look to adopt, and that would enable us to then be able to cooperate more fully and share the right data, both among industry players and with governments, in the knowledge that we are abiding by well understood and accepted and stable international legal frameworks. Yeah, so I think I'll stop here, but thank you for the time. Happy to take questions later on, of course.
Thank you very much, Jean-Jacques. A huge amount to digest and unpack there. Certainly interesting that the phrase, the Convention on Cybercrime, now requires a little further explanation to be clear what we're talking about. But I did appreciate and sort of seizing on one small part of what you were discussing there and linking to a lot of the other discussions around the centre this week is leveraging the UN agencies and the opportunities that they have for building that capacity in education. I have Bertrand here with a hand, and then Emily. I'm also seeing that Fazane Badi in the chat room has made some references and perhaps will be able to speak, and there is her hand. Wonderful, thanks. And then also Keith. So please, Bertrand.
Yeah. Many interesting thoughts in what Jean-Jacques was saying. One general element is that when we talk about online harms, it requires the same kind of coordination or multiple actions that the creation of the internet requires itself. The internet is the result of an enormous convergent effort by many actors, each doing something in their corner in a way that is coordinated and interoperable, yet independent. And I think when we're dealing with online abuse, we will need increasingly to have a better coordination between the different actors along what is labeled, and I think Keith has used it, along the stack. Whether it is DNS operators, registries and registrars, hosting providers, cloud providers, content delivery networks, and all sorts of actors along the stack. The second thing is, very briefly, I cannot emphasize enough what Jean-Jacques was saying about the importance of implementing multi-stakeholder approaches, consultation, co-drafting, development of legislations at each national level. Multi-stakeholder approach is not only for the global level. It will be implemented progressively at the national level and sometimes below the national level. In municipalities, you can develop rules by consulting broadly the actual stakeholders of this particular region. And I want to emphasize also that we're talking a lot about regulation, regulation, regulation. Regulation is something that still has a very, I wouldn't say rigid, but top-down approach where there's a regulator and the regulated. I think in many of the discussions that we have, we should be talking about setting the rules. Because setting the rules is more flexible. You can set the rules collectively, and the implementation of those rules can be one on another actor. And sometimes the implementation of the rule may not be done by the administration of a particular public authority. If you take the right to be forgotten, for instance, it is a private entity, in this case Google, that has been tasked by the highest judiciary authority in Europe to arbitrate between the right to freedom of access to information and the right to privacy. So setting the rules and distributing the roles and responsibilities between public actors and private actors is the essence of the multi-stakeholder approach, I believe. Another thing is, and Jean-Jacques was alluding to it, I can testify for having run a process within Internet and Jurisdiction. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself earlier. I'm the Executive Director of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. And during the last few years, we've run a process on the question of content moderation on large platforms. I can tell you that the question of what is the geographic scope of public authorities' requests for content restriction was an extremely contentious debate. I.e., for instance, can a court in one country, because the content is absolutely unacceptable, order a platform in another country to take this content down globally? And I will tell you, it was not possible to reach an agreement among a certain number of actors, because there's a question of territorial sovereignty and a question of public interest of dealing with abuses. So those questions of what is the extent of the role, the fact that when a registry or registrar acts at the level of the domain name system, the impact is global. Likewise, for the hosting provider, if you cut the access to a site without geolocalizing, you actually cut access to the site anywhere in the world. The geographic scope of action against abuses on content related is a very tricky topic because the legislations are different regarding the content. And I don't even get into the pharmaceuticals, into hate speech and things like that. And so there are some content that are going to be sufficiently egregious to be justifying an action at a global level, and others that will be trapped into the tension between the different legislations. And the final point is, Jean-Jacques again was alluding to a very, very, very problematic issue coming from the siloed approach of legislation. The tension between data protection obligations and the requirement for security and law enforcement has been an ongoing discussion. And unfortunately, when those legislations are being drafted, the other parts of the ministries or government are not sufficiently involved. And I've seen that in international negotiations when I used to be the French thematic ambassador for digital issues. You could have the representative of the French government, and it goes for any government, taking a particular position in one forum, whereas the Data Protection Authority was taking another position in another forum, because their orientation, their perspective on the different topics was not the same. And so this tension between the conflict of laws coming in one country or conflict of laws between different jurisdictions across borders is one of the biggest dangers for having something that is legally interoperable internationally. I think I've stopped here.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. I'm going to throw to Emily Farzani and then Keith maybe close us out before we have a very quick report from Georgia, our rapporteur. We have 15 minutes, so yeah, please bear that in mind. Emily, please.
Thanks. And I won't go on. I'm keen to hear from Fazi as well and the others. Actually, just on the final point that Bertrand mentioned, a really important one, which is the need for the different agencies within government to support a balanced approach. And I just wanted to highlight on this issue a recent advisory by the UK Information Commissioner, which is the National Data Protection Authority. Who cares really what the UK Data Protection Authority says, because we've left the European Union, but actually we're still bound by the same laws. So it is an interpretation of GDPR. And I think it's important for this debate. And it's guidance on scams and fraud. And what they are saying is there is no legal barrier under data protection to sharing information for the purpose of fighting scams and fraud, so long as it is done in a thoughtful and proportionate way. And I think this is a really important issue. It casts my mind back more than 20 years. And this is a very local example, so forgive me on this. There was 2 children were murdered in a small village in one part of the United Kingdom, Soham, and by a school caretaker who had previously been fired from his job in a different part of the country for concerns over child protection. And that information was not passed on to his new employer because of data protection issues. And that caused both the law enforcement and the data protection authorities to make very strong combined statements on how that was a poor interpretation of the law. And of course, it had tragic consequences. One just final point before closing. We've talked a lot about silos, and along with Jean-Jacques this year, we've been thinking a lot about fighting scams and fraud online, and how to encourage signal sharing in a thoughtful and data protection compliant way. And I think one of the things that illustrates how no single actor has the full view is thinking about scam journeys, thinking about attack chains, and how scammers will go from establishing an identity using infrastructure, and that's involving domain names, but also VPNs and other infrastructural elements, making that false identity, engaging with victims, then cashing out, which is when the banks start to see the fraud, and then rinse and repeat. And unless you're joining up the intelligence between those different silos in the fraud journey, you are not going to be able to get ahead of the frauds and scams, the cost of which at a global level is running into trillions of dollars, and only 0.05% of cyber criminals are currently prosecuted, according to the World Economic Forum. So we're not winning. It doesn't mean you throw human rights out the window, anticipating Fazi's next intervention. You have to do it in a rights-respecting, thoughtful way, but you also have to protect people from fraud and scams.
Thank you, Emily. And Dana, your right of reply. Sorry, can we please make Farzani a co-host? Sorry, our colleagues up the back in the AV. Hi, sorry. Yep. So Farzani will be able to unmute you momentarily. There you are. Hi.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So I'm sorry. I was in another session, so I missed some of the important points of discussion. But I just wanted to mention that so the Brussels effect of NIS2 might be an actual overreach and not necessarily show the leadership that they showed when they came up with GDPR. And that's not just because I am a overzealous activist for privacy. It's because GDPR was actually a general data protection law. It did not single out domain names. It did not single out different operations. Yes, of course, it affected different operations, but largely it brought privacy, much needed privacy for I want to say globally, but it did bring us, it did give us some tools to work with to bring some much needed privacy for domain name registrants whose sensitive data was published sometimes without them knowing, mailing address. It's including mailing address. And so one of the things that so NIS2 wants to backpedal all of these protections that we, after a long time, we have achieved, especially at ICANN, and I believe that it has had an adverse effect on the multi-stakeholder process, because NIS2 is not really addressing the loopholes that the multi-stakeholder community at ICANN could not come up with a solution. We just did not agree that the questions of accuracy of data, the questions of disclosure, we just didn't agree for multiple legitimate reasons that it should be treated and should be tackled in the way that NIS2 decided to tackle, which can lead to intellectual property overreach, which can lead to stripping domain name registrants off of their privacy rights. And it can also have an effect on network operators, on CCTLDs that are not for profit, and they have to now comply with this law. And in some circumstances, they say that it might not even help with security. And another thing is that, unfortunately, the implementation of NIS2 in different countries varies. Like, for example, in Belgium, if I remember correctly, intellectual property rights holder can ask for the domain name registrant private sensitive data, and they are not going to be informed about that request for their data. The data holder is not going to be informed about it. So these are like the transposition of the law is very problematic as well as its impact on the multi-stakeholder process that, unfortunately, we didn't but we were discussing these issues at ICANN, and somebody came up with a solution for us, which is going to have impact on human rights, on the multi-stakeholder model, and on various operation of networks.
Thank you very much, Fazi. Keith, I'd give the last word here to you.
Thank you, Chris. And I guess we'll hand it to Georgia after briefly. So thank you all very much. I want to just touch briefly on a couple of things, pulling from Jean-Jacques' remarks earlier about the need for multi-stakeholder engagement. I want to talk a minute about due process, and I want to tie it all together in the context of so-called trusted flaggers as an example, right? And so, you know, as we look at the attempt to mitigate online harms within our respective areas of responsibility and technical capabilities, the concept of trusted flaggers, which is typically outside of due process, right? It's typically something that is identified outside of a court order, where we are either asked, expected to, or encouraged to take the recommendations of an entity to take action within our capabilities. If it was a registry or a registrar, it's a domain name takedown, which disrupts the route to the content. If it's a content host, then it would be removal of the content itself. But the concept of trusted flaggers, I think, is an example where we as industry need to make sure that we have inputs from a range of stakeholders, civil society interests, to make sure that there's recourse for the impacted party, privacy, the ability to make sure that there's transparency about the actions that are being taken. We need to engage with law enforcement. We need to engage with those who would seek to be trusted notifiers or trusted verifiers when action is being requested outside of a court order or outside of the traditional due process. And so this is an important opportunity, I think, for industry to engage with a range of stakeholders as we develop our own processes and as we engage with authorities in terms of, whether we talk about regulation or, as Bertrand said, rulemaking, the opportunity to, do better, to be more proactive, and to get ahead of what regulation may come. But these are all important factors as we look to mitigate online harms moving forward. So thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much, Keith. So, yeah, I want to turn now to Georgia, who's been our sort of rapporteur, and ask perhaps if she's got some final takeaways or, takeaways from this session. Thanks, Georgia.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the engagement in this session. It's been an exciting discussion. And I think, from the first segment, we looked at the NIS2 directive and the extraterritoriality, looking at the Goldilocks effect. There's a lack of harmonization in the EU currently that's causing confusion. And also we looked at from the difficulty in terms of jurisdiction and that extraterritoriality effect is not clear to everybody. And then the second segment, we looked at the importance of industry collaboration to prevent online harms and the reluctance to sometimes tackle content, but that the importance to engage with different stakeholders across the stack, but also some of the practical realities of online harms. And that does tie into the difficulty with the NIS2 directive and implementing this directive in this complex ecosystem that we're in. And that better coordination between different actors across the stack, between DNS operators, registries, registrars, hosting providers, but also, as Keith just mentioned, law enforcement and everybody is really important. And also implementing multi-stakeholder approaches, not just at a global level, but at a national level, making it more efficient and better for us all, working together with regulators. So I guess those are my final takeaways, but I really appreciate everyone's engagement in this discussion. I think it's been, a fantastic discussion. And I think that's it from me.
Okay, thank you very much, Georgia. I want to thank all of our speakers. Jean-Jacques, I realize I didn't get a chance to get any final words from you. I don't know if you've got any sort of final, no? Okay, but
thank you very much for organizing. More dialogues needed on all this.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you for being here online. Emily, thank you for being our online speaker. Bertrand and Keith here in the room, thank you. David, our remote moderator, thank you very much for that. Thank you to all in the room who helped us to get through the audiovisual issues that we had. It took some effort, but I think we got there in the end. As Georgia and Jean-Jacques say, this is a discussion that needs to continue. We've built on last year's workshop with this one. I'm sure there'll be opportunities to continue this in only 6 months in Oslo. So yeah, look forward to the discussion continuing there. Thank you all.